All right, so next up, we're going to be hearing from Kathryn Kolb. She is a key member of the citizens group that's been working on drafting a new strong draft of the Tree Protection Ordinance. The citizens group is made up of Atlanta architects, builders, arborists, conservationists, and members of the Tree Conservation Commission. So it represents a diverse group of folks who have all contributed to creating this draft. The Citizens Blended Draft retains parts of the Planning Department's draft that are working, but while also addressing and closing loopholes, addressing equity, and simplifying the overall ordinance. This draft has been presented to City Council and it's in consideration to be voted on. Kathryn has over 30 years of field experience in forests and wildlands in the Southeast. She led an initiative to revise the DeKalb County Tree Ordinance and also served on the City of Atlanta Tree Ordinance Task Force. So she's got lots of experience with tree ordinances here in Atlanta. So she's going to be providing an overview of the Citizens Blended Draft, talk about the group's approach on tackling this ordinance, and she's going to be available to answer any questions you guys might have. All right, and then Kathryn, you're going to be sharing your screen, right?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So you can, I'll stop share now.
Okay, terrific. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. Let's see. All right, I'm going to do share screen. Okay, and then we have to do this, and then we'll go to slideshow view. All right, so let's go with here. So the work that we've done, we've been in the works on this for about 3 years, this particular draft of the tree ordinance, probably longer depending on how you count, but really solid, heavy lifting work to craft the right language and to, put the message in community for about 3 years. So the first place that we need to start on this, my other hat, as you may know, is I run a nonprofit organization called Eco Addendum, and I do environmental education all over Metro Atlanta. We've walked in every park. I'm very familiar with the natural resources that we have here, and from that, we've really learned that Metro Atlanta, we know Metro Atlanta is special, and we talk about our very special urban forest, but we don't think about how we came to it. Atlanta built out very, very differently from other major cities. So back in the day, in the 1600s and the 1700s, we had most of our major cities were port cities, Boston, New York. Even interior cities like Chicago, St. Louis were port cities. So they were built very densely back in the day when people were walking or traveling by horse or cart or something like that. Atlanta, first of all, our area, what is now Metro Atlanta, is an area between the Flint and the Ocmulgee Rivers. It's a little strip of Georgia that was Muskogee Creek territory until the Treaty of 1821. So that is really late in the game. Harvard University was founded 200 years before our area was even a part of the United States. And so back in those days, it was predominantly an old growth forest. There were some creek settlements, scattered around, but it was an old growth forest. When the lands were handed over to the American government, the development, there's an initial stage of development that begins around the 1830s. Very shortly thereafter, just a couple decades, we have the Civil War. This area remains economically depressed. No one is coming to the South, and no one is coming to Atlanta. The actual city of Atlanta was built as a railroad crossing. It didn't have that planter economic base that so much of the rest of the Deep South had. It was not based on a really highly structured economic system. It was mostly small farms, lots of dairy farms and pecan orchards, things like that. One of the reasons why we didn't have those large landscape farming operations here is because it's so hilly. Atlanta is a city of hills, Druid Hills, Collier Heights, the Highlands. We have hills everywhere. So what happened in terms of, how our landscape was developed is the flat areas were farmed, but the slopes were left. and they cut the timber off some of those slopes, but they usually did it selectively until really the middle of the 20th century. So what happens is we have lots of areas in Metro Atlanta that were skipped over in the building process. They weren't farmed and they weren't considered developable until very, very recently. When Atlanta does develop, it's in the 1960s, after air conditioning, and very importantly, after highways become the major form of transportation. So we developed, when we did develop, that we kind of jumped out into a sprawl type of development. And what happened is we again skipped over the steep slopes and the narrow stream corridors. So by accidents of history, Metro Atlanta has a very high and completely functioning ecology and ecosystem of our native forest. And our area is a forest. Our area isn't a desert. It's not a grassland. Our area in the southeastern United States, much like the Amazon is a rainforest, we are a forest. And Atlanta has that. Back even in the before the 1960s, most of our older neighborhoods, even when people did build, they saved large shade trees in the yard. So they weren't clearing the whole lot. They were just clearing an area just for the house. They built a foundation and the trees were saved. So accidents of history gave Atlanta this very special forest. It wasn't ever planned and it's not protected. So now that we have mostly tear downs we're tearing down our smaller houses, our modified houses. When we do that, we're grading the entire lot and we're cutting almost all the trees. And that is an unsustainable trend that's taking place right now in Metro Atlanta. We are literally losing the forest in our neighborhoods. And 95% of Atlanta's trees and forests is located on private property, and it's predominantly in R4 zoning. So what happens to the tree ordinance and what happens in the zoning code is going to very greatly affect how much forest we have left in Metro Atlanta. About 80% is located in single family residential. That's predominantly in R4. Atlanta also, you're probably familiar with the statistics. We're the first worst city in the US in tree loss, the third worst city in the US in temperature rise. And the current tree ordinance, the way it's supposed to work, when it was designed back in 2004, 2005, there was supposed to be a recompense fee that was a deterrent to people cutting trees. But what has occurred, that recompense fee is very low. So cutting trees has become a cost of doing business and it's not a deterrent. So we're losing our trees. The only time it's a deterrent is sometimes where people can't afford to cut trees, which is sort of not fair because people who are in high value real estate tend to be able to cut their trees, and people perhaps in areas where the real estate value or their income is more modest maybe have some trouble paying those fees. In addition, the city audit found there are multiple instances of the planning department's misuse of the tree trust fund monies, which is the tree trust fund is when people cut trees, that's where all that funding goes, is into the tree trust fund. Michelle already talked a little bit about who we are and where we came from. We've consulted on this process. We have consulted with dozens of people to get the language. We know that we need a tree ordinance. We know it has to be practical. You can't have an idealistic tree ordinance. It has to work for everybody, including builders and developers. So we spent a lot of time very carefully crafting our ideas and the language that supports them. So the idea is that we need to have a balanced tree ordinance. We're not going to save all our trees, but let's at least try and save the best ones. So we came up with the idea of priority trees, and we came up with a way that you can have a kind of a standard of what a priority tree is. We created that standard. And we actually had some conversations with the planning department. The planning department, just to give a little bit of background, the planning department spent about the last 3 years gathering public input on the tree ordinance. They hired two different consultants. One was the biohabitats group. They didn't actually come up with a draft, even though their contract said they were supposed to. So then planning department hired another set of consultants, and they had about that point a couple years, tons of meetings, lots of public input. And the draft that they came up with didn't reflect any of the public input. So we felt that was kind of a problem. And so that's kind of how our group became more involved in not just making suggestions, because the suggestions weren't being adopted, but in actually writing up the suggestions in adoptable form. So we had done such a good job with that, that a couple of the city council people from the CDHS committee said, you know, you guys have done a whole lot of work on this. Why don't you get together and work with the planning department? And so we did that. This would have been in the late spring and early summer of 2020. So we worked directly with the planning department, and they actually adopted one of our concepts, which was to have a disturbance area that's essentially the same as the impervious area is today, and that you would have to save priority trees outside that area. They didn't quite have quite the same numbers. It was pretty close, but they adopted that concept, which we thought was really great progress. But shortly thereafter, they introduced a kind of a loophole into that so that it would actually undercut that requirement. And when we look through the planning department draft, and it has changed a little bit in the last year and a half, we find tons of contradictory language and loopholes, so that there's some feel-good language over in one place, and then you look somewhere else and basically you don't have to do it. There are a couple of situations where basically the planning department can have arbitrary decision-making without standards on whether or not even the requirements apply. So we needed to kind of shore that up. The other thing that the planning department did, and this is a pattern that's occurred that we're seeing also in the zoning code, and I believe in the CDP. I'm not an expert on the CDP, but I'm working closely with some other people who are, that there's sort of a trend to try to reduce appeals and neighborhood input. So the way some trees are being saved in the current ordinance is that in the current ordinance, the planning department, the city arborist, is supposed to not allow trees in the setbacks to come down. It's written in the code, but they do it all the time. They allow trees to come down the setbacks. In my neighborhood, case in point, tree is in the setback right on a fence line. It's not even that big. It's a 30-inch diameter post oak. And when it was cut, I counted the rings, it was 280 years old. These are just trees in our neighborhood. We literally have the old growth forest in our neighborhoods on lots that haven't been graded recently. It's not in every lot, it's not in every yard, but I live in Eastlake, historic neighborhood. There are trees that are 200 years old around, and they're getting cut every day. And I know that's true of other neighborhoods as well. But the requirement that's on the books today is that you're supposed to save trees in the setback, but the plan reviewers routinely allow these to be cut. So the recourse of that is to make an appeal, which actually puts the burden of enforcing the law on private citizens, which is, you know, probably not quite right. But right now you can appeal if a tree in a setback is being cut. And so a lot of times people are winning those appeals. The new draft of the new planning department draft, even though they adopted some of our concepts, they retain what's ready to be voted on right now in city council is essentially an elimination of the appeals process. We think that's a bad idea. And that is also consistent with the, you're probably familiar with the zoning code proposal, which is to do a blanket rezoning of single family residential into MRMU. If the city's version of the tree ordinance was adopted, not ours, but the city's version, then everything that was SFR that got converted to MRMU would be exempt from the tree ordinance, because the city planning department draft has zero protections for trees that are in a commercial classification. If our draft is adopted, the citizens amended version, the blended draft, then even if single family residential lots were rezoned to MRMU, there would still be a tree, either tree save or a green space area planting requirement. So that's an important point that's being missed, is that it's been said in a couple of these presentations that the tree ordinance would apply to these kinds of things, and it's not true. It would not apply according to the planning department draft. So tree preservation on commercial multifamily, we have a mechanism, and we actually have a very interesting mechanism. I mean, you know, there are some there are some situations where you have commercial developments and you're really not going to be able to save any trees. You can't move a house around, you can't move a garage around. If you're building a big box structure, you kind of have to put it where you have to put it. There's not that much flexibility. So what we say is, that's okay, there may be times, but you still don't get out of your requirement. So the city still gets something for that. So we say there's a percentage of either tree save, you can do it tree save, or you can do it as green space. If you don't want to meet that, then there's a payment in lieu, which you can do, which is what City of Charlotte does. And so there's a fee for that, so that the tree trust fund would actually get revenue from having street trees cut down in such a circumstance. Or we've introduced cap and trade, and we had an attorney write that section for us. So cap and trade would mean if you're in a dense area of downtown and you want to build a commercial structure and you really don't want to have to meet that tree save requirement or that green space area requirement, then you could purchase, and you'd have to have an easement. It would go with the deed. You could purchase, essentially it's the opposite. It's a conservation easement, essentially what you're purchasing from a private, maybe another commercial property owner. Maybe it's some plant over there that has 25 acres over by the Chattahoochee River, and they're thinking of selling out and moving to some other city, and they're not really using that property. That property would then be deeded as permanently protected green space. So the city actually gets something, even it's lenient. You can't make commercial people build around trees. That's not necessarily viable. You can do that on single family residential, but commercial is a little different. But let's not give up our requirement. Let's make sure the city gets something for that. So we think that's a really fair way to work with commercial. And in multifamily, we actually say that you must either save existing trees on site or replant, because we're having commercial developments, we're having multifamily developments all the time, back to back to back, that have 0 trees. I actually taught a class recently there's a group of kids that have at least one parent is an incarcerated parent, and they're in at-risk communities in Southwest Atlanta. And we did a kind of a virtual, during COVID, we did a virtual series of forest walks for these kids. And the leader of the group said, we gave them some home for, find a tree that you really like and draw it, and learn what species it is. And the leader of that program said, you can't expect these kids to do that. They live in multifamily units where it's project after project after project, and there are no trees. They only see trees from the window of a bus. That's today in Metro Atlanta. And yet we're allowing multifamily structures to go up with no saving of existing trees and no even room to plant new trees. So we think that's not good for Atlanta. So we want to make sure we get some trees in multifamily. The Tree Trust Fund, what the planning department recommendation, and even though they have already misused tree trust funds, they in their draft, they would take away the Tree Conservation Commission's role in making recommendations of how those tree trust monies were spent, and it would be handled, and the word in the draft is solely, by the planning department. Provisions for homeowners, we actually came up with a way, it's a little burdensome sometimes to homeowners, particularly in some areas of Atlanta where there's lots of trees that have been growing up. And they may have some smaller trees, lots of pines, things like that. We need to have a little bit of flexibility for homeowners. So we suggested that you could take up to, there's already an idea on the table that you can take a certain number of trees up to in a 3-year period. And so we said that you could take up with a combined total of 20 inches in diameter of trees, which means, you could have like, 2 8-inch trees and a 6-inch tree or something like that. Every 3 years, if you've been a homeowner for a year, there has to be some stipulations so that people who are flipping houses aren't just cutting trees, right? So we instituted that into our draft, and it's a little bit more flexible. The planning department draft also has that. They kind of copied us on that one too. But ours has more flexibility. And of course, you would not have to pay recompense for this. So it's a little bit of a relief to homeowners. homeowners would have a little more flexibility to take down some of the trees they might need to take down. That's not going to be the big oak in the yard because that's going to be a priority tree, but for non-priority trees, they would have this flexibility. The other thing we instituted that's not in the planning department draft, and someone I work with in another part of Atlanta, but where a lot of times there are people next door who are either absentee landlords or they may you may not have the funds to take care of a hazardous tree, and that tree is poised, or maybe they just don't want to. That tree is poised to fall on a neighbor's house. Right now, the city arborist, if that tree was going to fall on the street, it's a hazardous tree that was going to fall onto public property, the city arborist can come out and assess that tree and tell the homeowner that they have to do something about it, but not if it's going to fall on a neighbor's yard, which really doesn't make any sense. So we wrote into our draft that the city arborist would be authorized to assess whether a tree was hazardous if it's going to fall on private property. The reason I kind of bring that up is the person who told me this story had this case. The tree fell on the house and actually killed somebody in the house because it was on a neighboring property and no one did anything about it. It wasn't their property. They couldn't cut it down. They called the city. The city didn't do anything about it. A very tragic story. The other thing that we put in our draft, and the planning department actually adopted our part of that, is to provide assistance to low-income homeowners so that we could use some of the tree trust fund money. It could not probably be done directly by City of Atlanta staff, but create a mechanism by where tree trust fund money could be used to remove hazardous trees from private properties where people could not afford to do that themselves. Closing current loopholes. That's just we can look through some of this. There's a ton of loopholes in this ordinance. Typically what happens is when we make a presentation, and I very much appreciate you guys taking the time to listen to a full presentation today. You get, 5 minutes. There's going to be 3 major points. And no one ever really looks at the details. And as everybody knows, the devil is in the details. And the planning department draft is just chock full of crazy details, places where the ordinance conflicts. There's one requirement that conflicts with another. It's just not a well-written document. And experts didn't write it. They both of the consultants that were hired failed to do a draft, and so they really didn't have anybody to write it. It's just been pieced together. If the planning department draft is adopted, there are just going to be a ton of unintended problems that are going to take place because it's literally in the language. We've gone through the document and come through. Here's an example I don't actually have written up that I think I may have sent this the other day, but there's a requirement to replace trees, and there's a recompense requirement. The way the planning department draft works is the recompense replacement requirement is all intertwined together. So everything is kind of based on everything else. You can never really tease out exactly what the recompense is, because you can change that with a replacement requirement, and you can also do offsite planting. It's really complicated. We broke ours apart. So if you cut down trees, there's a recompense fee, and then you can actually, you can subtract your replanting from that. And then you only have to replant where there's room. So we only require you to replant trees when there's an area there's enough room to do it. And we don't require replanting off-site, because if you require replanting off-site, there's no way to track that.
Kathryn, could you just address what recompense means, just in case some folks aren't as familiar with the term, and also what that number is right now?
Right. So the recompense fee, I can look in the draft when we get through this. The recompense fee is essentially a fee when people cut trees. There are lots of values. We all know that there are very real values that trees provide, and one of the big ones that has a direct cost to the city is in stormwater. When we lose our trees and we add more impervious surface, we are exponentially increasing stormwater. We may have a stormwater utility fee. We have to do infrastructure rebuilds in our sewer system, really expensive stuff. And so that there's a cost to the city when we lose trees. So the idea with the tree trust fund is that the city has to gain something. They have to get something for the trees that are lost. You have to pay the city for the cost. And a lot of that goes back into replanting trees. But recently we also can now purchase green space. So right now the tree trust fund, you can plant trees or you can buy green space that's permanently protected with tree trust fund. Tree trust fund money was used to buy Lake Charlotte, for instance, that property. But in any case, the recompense is what you have to pay. The city came up with a figure for recompense and we took them at their word. We went ahead and used their figure. We're like, okay, that's what y'all want for recompense. We'll adopt that. But what the city also did, and if you look carefully in their draft, they have two different preservation standards, which essentially means that you can pick the least, the one that saves the least trees, because of course, you know, from a building perspective, in most cases, not in all, but there's a great interest among many in the building community to clear as many trees off the lot as possible, because you can put up as large of a structure as you can. Well, of course, if you do that, we're getting more stormwater runoff and all of that. You can build with trees, particularly in these residential areas. So in any case, there's a fee to the recompense fee to cut the trees, and it's a set fee. If you go to the city's draft, they say in one location that you only actually have to pay the recompense / replanting is only 75% for priority trees and 50% for non-priority trees. Then in another clause, it says that if you simply meet the law, which you already have to meet, you're not doing anything additional. You're not doing something extra. You're meeting the law, then you get to take another 50% off of that, which means that the recompense, the replanting recompense is only 37.5% for priority trees and 25% for non-priority trees. So it's written in there, but nobody sees this stuff. Ours is 100% for priority trees, and we give people a break on non-priority trees. It's 0.7, so 70% for non-priority trees. There's another loophole that's currently in the ordinance on the books right now, which is about boundary trees, and that is, say we have two lots adjacent to each other, and there's a big tree. There's a lot that's being developed is lot A, and lot B has a large tree kind of over near the developing lot, and that homeowner would like to cut that tree down because they just don't want to rake the leaves. Well, they can't do that. They would not be allowed to take that tree down. But if the builder says, hey, I'd like to take that tree down, and by the way, I'll pay for that, so you don't have to. The reason I want to take that tree down is because the critical root zone is coming into my lot. I'd like to get rid of that so I can build out more of my lot, or I can make sure that, you know, I can put the driveway on the right side instead of the left side. So right now, if the neighbor signs off on it, a builder can actually pay the neighbor to cut that tree. That's happened in my neighborhood. It happens a lot of the time. So what we said is that you can't actually take that tree, but you can impact up to 30%, 33% of the critical root zone. As you may know, scientifically speaking, or I guess legally speaking, if you impact you can impact up to 20% of the critical root zone of somebody else's tree, and the tree will probably be fine. So you don't have to do anything. If you impact between 20% and 33% of the critical root zone, then the tree may have some issues and you need to either do root pruning or watering. There may be some kinds of prescriptions that need to happen to ensure that tree stays healthy. After 33% destruction of the critical root zone, that tree is considered lost. So that's really the amount of space we're talking about, is allowing up to 33%, but not being able to actually take the whole tree. We also have a way of identifying the highest value trees, which we call priority trees. The city actually adopted our term priority trees. And we came up with a comprehensive list, and I worked very closely with Tirson Boutte, a Boutte tree, to come up with the correct species per size. So, you know, some of our tree species are growing really fast, and if you know, pines or tulip poplars or sweet gums, you know, in a 15 years, you've got a pretty good sized tree, which means if you cut that tree and you plant a new one, you can get that value back fairly shortly. But there are other trees that take a much longer time to grow. And if you cut them, you don't get that value back for 100 years or more. So we have a list where and lists all the species. The planning department only lists a few species. Our species also lists mid-story and understory trees because some of those are indicators of that original forest soil that we're talking about. So if we see certain types of trees, they have a high value because if you protect those trees, you're protecting literally the soil in which they're standing. And those are the best soils for retaining a healthy urban forest and even for replanting new trees. Without sidelining too much about soils, soils are considered a non-renewable resource, and there's a kind of a crisis in soil right now. And when we grade that landscape, when you take that topsoil off and you turn that landscape into clay, among other things, the clay in our area has very high content of aluminum. So you're actually putting, when you plant trees in a graded area, you're actually sticking them into an area that has toxicity to their roots. So this kind of grading and sticking trees in a graded area is never going to reproduce our forests. A lot of times trees and certainly other species can't really make it on those conditions. So we have, yeah, I talked about that a little bit. The replanting requirements, if you try and read the city's draft, and I have actually I have a sheet on that we can look at where you read what the city's replanting requirements are. Ours are very simple comparatively. We just basically say if you have X amount of space, you plant overstory. If you have X amount of space, you plant midstory. You have X amount of space, you plant understory. It's really simple. Dead, dying, and hazardous trees. Right now, as you may be aware, the planning department has been approving all of these dead, dying, and hazardous tree removals, which there's no appeals process for them. So if you come to the planning department and you say, I have a dead, dying, and hazardous tree, and during COVID, they weren't going out and doing any site checks, you just send a photo or just tell them you need to cut it, and they approve 94% of those. I have personally seen many, many trees that were condemned as dead, dying, and hazardous. In most cases, it is associated with a building permit, because when a tree is considered to be dead, dying, and hazardous, they don't have to pay recompense. So I've seen site plans where literally half of the trees that were submitted in the site plan were called dead, dying, and hazardous by the builder, because they're just trying to see what they can get away with, literally. And so there's a very high approval rating on dead, dying, and hazardous trees, though the city doesn't have a set standard. I mean, it's kind of like whoever goes out. One person may decide that tree is dead and the other person may not. You know, if they had a cup of coffee that morning, you know, they may take more time to investigate it or something like that. That's kind of where we are. I've seen trees come down that were healthy trees and considered to be dead, dying, and hazardous. That's kind of a problem and a loophole today that is not fixed in the city's draft, but it is fixed in ours, because what we did, and again, Tirsen Boutte helped to write this standard. He's a very highly respected arborist, and we used the TRAC. It's a national risk assessment system called TRAC. And so we would require the city arborist to use that system in identifying which trees are dead, dying, and hazardous. This talks a little bit about how the changes to the zoning code would affect tree protection. I talked to that about a little bit. If we use the city's draft, the MRMU would be exempt. There would be no tree ordinance. The other thing, and the city has changed this, the planning department has changed this. In a typical R4 lot, if we go ahead and keep the tree preservation requirement, there actually is some space to either preserve existing trees or plant new trees. I don't know if you can see the lot on the left, and just a couple of weeks ago, the planning department had said that it was going to be a 75, that they were going to propose a 75% impervious cover for MRMU. That had not been there. It was added, and then it is now sort of been taken out. So they're kind of backing off of that. But the fact they even suggested it is a really aggressive move to do a blanket rezoning where there is no public input process, because it's a zoning that's by right. so there's no rezoning, and then to up the lot coverage to 75%. That basically would mean that it would be legal to have not one single tree standing, and I mean that literally, in a half-mile radius of all of our MARTA stations. That's what what would happen under that. There's also some language that talks about how the planning department can make arbitrary decisions. And this is something that I won't mention names, but one of the largest, well-known builder in Atlanta said that he does not like this, because he says that the way the law is written, the way the planning department is proposing, the city staff has extraordinarily arbitrary powers in deciding which trees stay or which trees go. And if you think about what that means, it means how much of a lot you can build on is an arbitrary decision without a clear set of standards. So we think that's a big mistake. And we've cleaned that up in our draft. So basically, if the planning department draft, which is poised to be voted on, just as ours is right now, it's not going to deter any more tree loss than we're seeing now. In many instances, it may increase it. It eliminates the right of appeal. There's no tree save areas for multifamily and commercial, and the whole thing is contradictory and complicated. And if you take a second to look at it, you will see that. Our citizens draft preserves some trees on all properties, especially single family residential. That's actually, someone typed that up. That's not entirely correct. In commercial, we don't require saving existing trees in commercial. You are required to have some amount of green space, but you can meet that with tree saves, you can meet it with payment in lieu, and you can meet it with cap and trade. So on all residential properties, there would be a tree save requirement focused on priority trees. Our ordinance is clear and simple, and it has more flexibility for homeowners and a little bit more protection for homeowners for hazardous trees. So those are just the big picture. There's so much detail in this. The document itself is about 60 some pages. But I'd be happy to talk more in detail about any of those things, answer questions. And if you have any great ideas that we haven't thought of, we'd be happy to incorporate them as well. There's some, if you want to kind of keep up with this, if you go to cityintheforest.org, that's kind of our clearinghouse. Our draft tree ordinance is posted there. The city's draft tree ordinance is posted there. There's a comparison chart of kind of the cliff notes of the differences that's posted there. And then periodically calls to action, when to write your city council people, is also there. At this point in the process, it's all about city council. The planning department has stopped listening to input. And there's a number of groups who have made lists, really good lists that have excellent input, but they're not going to adopt that. The only thing that can make a better ordinance is what we've done, which is we actually took the suggestions of all the groups that we've been working with, which is pretty much everybody I can think of in the metro area who's interested in this. And we have met with them at various points and adopted a couple of things were suggested were not practical. We can't, you can't save all the trees. That's just not practical. Can't do that. But what was practical to do, we have adopted it. And so we are really hoping to get a lot more support for the blended draft, which is essentially an amended version of the city's draft. And I can put that on my screen too, if you want to flip through and look at some of that.
All right, thank you so much, Kathryn. I know that was a lot of information, but yeah, so I sent you guys that comparison chart. And as Kathryn mentioned, what they did is actually put together a draft to be voted on, not just a list of suggestions. So if you guys like what you heard, or if you guys have more questions, you can reach out to Kathryn. And if you are in support of this, what you can do is contact your council members and tell them to vote for this particular draft. So I just wanted to also open the floor up to any questions that you guys might have had throughout the presentation. I know someone asked a question about whether you'd be permitted to remove dead or diseased trees as long as that's confirmed. I think
Yes.
that question popped up before you got to that slide, but
Yes, yes, we didn't change how the dead, dying, and hazardous application was handled. So it's exactly the same way it's handled today in terms of the process. If you have a dead, dying, and hazardous tree, there is no appeal. If you have an emergency, you can get a permit immediately, or you can have the arborist come out and take a look at it. The only thing we changed in dead, dying, and hazardous was a set of clear standards that any arborist going out could understand and meet, so that we're only losing trees that truly are dead, dying, and hazardous. We're not losing healthy trees that just have a ding and a nick in them, which is what we're seeing a lot today, particularly of a lot of our older trees. We have trees in our ecosystem that live easily 500, 600, 700, sometimes longer. And if you have a tree that's lived that long, yeah, it's going to have lost a branch. Yeah, there's maybe going to be a little cavity where squirrels live. I mean, there's going to be some things. But if you're a good arborist, should be able to distinguish between a ding and a nick. I mean, all of us that are over 40 or 50, we have some little problem, right? We're not.
I'm in my 30s and I got a lot of problems.
Yeah, I mean, we're not ready to be eliminated as being dead or dying quite yet, but we all have little stuff. Now, there's other times when things really are a problem. If you have certain kind of fungus on a tree, it will kill that tree. It's going to kill the tree. Whereas another kind of fungus, the tree can tolerate, right? So somebody needs to know the difference and be able to make that call, and it needs to be a clear set of standards. And so we have that in our draft.
Yeah, or like to avoid the situation that you said earlier, they're not even diseased or dead at all. If they weren't going out and confirming, and these builders were just cutting them down. They could just get approved without them being even checked out.
Yeah. I'm going to share my, while we're still talking, let me share my screen again, if that's okay.
Yeah, actually, we have one more question just
sorry.
before we do that, if you don't mind. Someone asked, thank you, Kathryn. I noticed the comparison chart was last updated in April, and the city council has canceled a number of meetings about the ordinance. When will this vote take place? And do you have a sense of which version they will adopt? So that's from Nancy. And yeah, this has been held in committee for a long time. But yeah. I think November, right? We're thinking.
Yeah. So at first, lots of things have happened. They were going to focus on the zoning stuff, but the planning department got so much pushback on the zoning stuff that that's definitely now getting bumped to next year. So the tree ordinance is now, I think, back on the hot seat. And so what we have been told, and this changes all the time because we were told they were going to vote on it last spring, but what we have been told is that they're seriously looking at a vote in November or December. And we're taking them on their word to that. And so we are out really trying to get the word out on this. It will make a big difference which version is voted on. It will make a really big difference for Atlanta. And I will say this as well. Of course, I'm a person that would like to see lots of tree protected, but it has to be practical. We can't save all the trees. Just not going to be possible. And in fact, we're not even going to be able to save that many. Our draft is the only draft that really saves something meaningful. And people will say, Kathryn, I can't believe you did all that work. And look at these trees that are still coming down. Realistically, we live in a society that, isn't going to accept a super strong ordinance. It's just not possible, and it's not practical. So even though I am a great conservationist and preservationist and all of that, I have worked very, very hard on a draft that is practical and adoptable and that works for builders. And if they say it doesn't work for them, it's not because it doesn't work administratively, it's because they don't want it. And that's the draft that we have on the table, because we've talked to, there's a lot of builders, honestly, that are custom builders that say this would actually be better for them because it raises the playing field. So they don't have to compete in the marketplace with the lowest common denominator, clear the lot and put up something fast and, just it's a lot cheaper, not using an architect. Right now, what they're doing is they're clearing a lot. They don't use an architect. They download a stock plan, even for $1 million houses, right? So the profit margin is huge, and people who are doing custom homes have to compete with that. So custom home builders, this would actually, give us better, more interesting housing stock where people might choose to renovate rather than tear that house down. If this is instituted, we will not only save more trees, we will have a better city in terms of more healthily designed homes. And it's
And
not
the
really going to
voices
change
of builders and developers were represented in the citizens group too, right?
Yeah, I mean, we had meetings. We've met a couple times. Developers never want you to say their name in public, so I'm not really going to say that. But we've met with some of the biggest developers in Atlanta, right? And they really like the idea of the pre-application conference. We instituted that because right now the way it works is if you're a builder, you buy a property, you go through all this process, this permitting process to get something approved. And then by the time you've gone to the city 1 million times, it's 6 months or a year later, someone says, hey, I think you should try and save this tree. Well, you've got a huge investment in a plan that's been approved. So it's very, it's not practical and it's expensive to redesign at that stage. So what we did, and we got this partly from talking to builders, we created a pre-application conference that you can have with the city arborist that you can have even before you purchase the property. Mm-hmm. So that way you can know exactly what trees you're going to save or not save up front before you design the structure. That's the way to get it done. You have to put trees in the beginning. You have to plan for trees at the beginning of the process. You can't try to save trees at the end of the process. Builders love that. In fact, some builders have actually gone to the city and say they've wanted to be able to do that, but the current law won't let them. So the city kind of sort of adopted our pre-application conference, but they didn't. It was kind of a very half-hearted effort, and it doesn't have the requirements that we have that really make good sense. Where if you're going to take particularly in single family residential, you should be having a plan that goes to the city arborist that shows the original structure, because a lot of times trees would grow to the original house. So when you go to put another house on that property, what you need to do is use the footprint of that original structure. Right now, they're not required to show it. So they just come with a lot, they show the trees, no one even knows a house was there. So it's really difficult to identify what the best placement for the house, where the house should go in order to protect the trees that are on the property. If you'll let me share my screen just for 1 second.
Yeah, and then when you're done, if I just also wanted to, usually we take some time if anyone in the group has announcements on things that they think would be of interest to this group. If you guys have any upcoming events or programming that this group should know about. John, I don't mean to put you on the spot and you don't have to turn your camera on or anything, but if there's anything new coming out of the mayor's office that you want to talk to us about, we'd love to hear that too.
And hi, it's Amy Williams. I just wanted to have it's a question / comment as I'm listening to all this and I'm thinking practically about it. It's almost like, I know that we're setting up a trust, or that's the goal, but what I hear in all of this analysis is that we need more arborists. I've had at least 3 different arborists at my home, and each one may have a varying opinion about, it's like, well, the first one said that this tree, check it every 5 years, it's going to need to come down because of the way it's leaning. But this one says it's okay, just take a picture and measure it every couple years and make sure it's not. And so I'm thinking, and I hear the city arborist has an opinion and is going to be important. I almost feel like we need to make sure that we have funding available, maybe it's coming from the trust or somewhere, for the arborists who are going to be involved for the city to enforce this, because otherwise I'm concerned that I'm feeling overwhelmed for that city arborist, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I would just tell you, in the conversations that we've had with a number of the key council people who are really have kind of taken on this issue, I think everybody knows that we need more arborists and that they're prepared to put up the funds to hire them. So I think that's coming.
That's great to know. Thank you.
Thanks for bringing that up, Amy.
I'm just want to flip through. I think people can see my screen now. Basically what we did, and this is on our website, is this is the city's draft. All the black type is the planning department draft, and all the blue type are the changes that we made. So when you flip through, you kind of see there's some areas where we made changes, and there's a lot of areas where we didn't. So we still have a few scratch outs there, but a lot of it is the same thing. But then there are some key differences, and some of the key differences is when we get down to like Division 7. This is the draft version that has some highlight. If you look on our website, it won't have all this pre-highlight. These are just kind of our notes. But if we go down to Division 7, this is where we made a lot of changes, this is the tree preservation standard. We eliminated that kind of dual standard where it's really complicated, and basically at the end of the day, the builder just decides which standard is the least standard and meets that one. And that's kind of a loophole. So we also put in, if you look, here's some of the details that we've thought very carefully about. It's under division section where it says number 2 here for lots under 10,000 square feet. We want to make sure that if we're requiring people to save existing trees, you can't make somebody build their home footprint, and that's something that's like 10 feet wide and 30 feet long, right? That's not really fair. So what we did is we instituted a little requirement. So for lots under 10,000 square feet, these really small lots, the maximum disturbance area shall be required to be less than 33% of the lot's average width by no more than 20% of its length, which ensures that a builder has a reasonable size footprint. And we consulted with builders and asked them if that was enough, and they said yes. So these are some of the details we have really worked through. The city doesn't have things like that. Their draft is really, really hard to follow and pretty complicated, and then really weak. At the end of the day, it's a lot of confusion, but the result is that you kind of don't have to do much. And our tree planting requirements, we eliminated a lot of the confusing language. Our tree planting requirements really simple. Basically, 1 overstory tree for every 640 square feet, 1 mid-story tree for every 320 square feet, 1 understory tree for every 120 square feet. That way, we get trees back on sites, and you're not planting off site somewhere. A lot of the off-site plantings aren't protected, because if you have a tree, the city actually allows you to plant off-site to meet your tree planting requirement. You can plant off-site on private property, which means that that tree isn't going to be protected, or they have a clause where they say they're going to track it for 10 years. I mean, how they're going to track that, I don't really know. But even after 10 years, a tree could be only, 15 inches in diameter, maybe less, and it can be cut. So that requirement isn't meaningful. What we're doing is something really practical. We're saying, just plant trees that fit on your site. We're not going to make you go plant them somewhere else. But you know what? Guess what? If you can't fit an overstory tree, I bet you can fit a mid-story or an understory tree. So we're going to get high value trees on these sites in a practical way that makes sense. So anyway, I'll just kind of flip through, and you see we have some areas. We have an area for cluster design. So we would have you'd have to have a zoning change to make that happen. But I don't know if you guys are familiar with cluster design, but right now, if you have a subdivision, let's say you have a 10-acre site, and you're going to put 40 houses in there, right? Right now, what happens is you clear cut that entire site, and you cookie cutter set up the lots, and you have 40 houses. And there's hardly any, right now, there's no requirement to save any of those trees, according to the city's draft and according to the current draft. We have a requirement to save the trees, and we also have an incentive. So if you do cluster design, which means that you reduce the setbacks and the frontage, so you cluster those houses and you save a lot of green space, you could actually get a density bump. And furthermore, that could be an affordable unit, right? Or a couple affordable units. No one is thinking creatively. Everyone is talking about ways to accommodate things. And when it comes down to the actual code, where the rubber meets the road of what happens to the landscape, it's turning out regressive out of this planning department. We've got some really great ideas. There's a cluster design project. In fact, one of the builders that consulted with us is the builder that's doing Prendergast Farms project, which is in DeKalb County over by the Grove Park neighborhood. It's a cluster design project. I think the original amount of units they were going to get was like 20. They're going to have 24 units, and they're saving 70% of the property as green space. One of the units is a small units for an organic farmer, and they have room on the property for a farmer. They're going to have like a little farm and garden for this person. I mean, this is how we can do things. And it's not being reflected in these new drafts. What's reflected in what's coming out of this particular, administration's planning department is regressive stuff that just opens up the doors, clears more of the lot, doesn't preserve the trees, and does it faster and without public input. And we think that's regressive, and Atlanta's at a turning point. We think that's a bad way to go.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Kathryn, for pointing us through everything. And we learned a lot today from you. I appreciate it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to send the City and the Forest website and also your contact information, if you're okay with that, to the group so folks can reach out.
Yeah, absolutely.
And learn how they can support this. We've gone a little over time. I want to be respectful of everybody's time here, but.
Well, I appreciate y'all taking the time to listen to this. It's hard to read through these kind of things, but it's really important at the end of the day. So thank you guys for caring and paying close attention. Thank you.
Thank you for your hard work and for giving us a good education today. We really appreciate it.
Awesome. All right.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Thanks, everybody.